Certainly.
Okay. I'm hitting record here, so.
So is Chad, so he's,
Okay.
yeah. Cyriaco, my name is Craig Smith. I'm co-hosting the seminar along with Sean, so it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for spending the couple of nights with us this week.
Hello, Craig. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's
oh,
great.
You are the Premiere Productions image, right?
I am the Premiere Productions image. I'm outside enjoying the Florida winter time, and so I am sans video, so my signal doesn't break up.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, Craig.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
All right, everybody. I'll go ahead and start. Cyriaco Lopes is an associate professor at John Jay College, and he's actually been a visiting artist here before at University of Florida. I first met Cyriaco through Alex Alberto, who used to teach in the art history department here, the critic and writer. And he introduced me to Cyriaco and brought him into the visiting artist program. And we've stayed in touch ever since. And before I talk about all of his successes and great things, I just wanted to say something about that I really appreciate about Cyriaco, and is that he is a true fan researcher. He really follows, likes to look at art in person, and is always researching and finding new things. He's a really fun person to go look at art with and talk with. He's constantly thinking and reassessing things and looking for new things and talking and relating it to art history. And so it's just something that I really admire. In addition to his work, is just his dedication to the field. But he not only teaches at John Jay College at the City University in New York, but he also teaches and has taught previous to that at Stetson University for a low residency MFA of the Americas in poetry in the expanded field. And his major project right now since 2017 has been Saints and Martyrs, which has been selected for exhibitions at the Houston Center for Photography by Yasufumi Nakamori, who's now the chief curator of photography at Tate Modern. He's also the LA Center for Digital Art by Bryan Barcena at MoCA LA, and Nicholas Barlow at LACMA. The work was also selected for residencies in 2018 in Turkey, at MassMoca in 2019, and the MacDowell Colony, where Lopes was a 2019 Marian O Naumburg Photography Fellow. He's a New York-based artist from Brazil, and has exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, the Museum of Art São Paulo, El Museo del Barrio in New York City, the Centre Wallonie in Brussels and Paris, and the Casa Degli Artisti in Milan, among other international venues. He has been curated by artists such as Lygia Pape, Janine Antoni, Luciano Fabro, and by art critics Paulo Herkenhoff, Adriano Pedrosa, and Alberto Saraiva. He's the winner of the New York City World Studio Foundation Award, the Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis Project Award, the São Paulo Phillips Prize of Trip to Europe. And he works in performances also in collaboration with the poet Terry Whittick, who's, I believe, still based in Florida at DeLand.
Yes.
And they have been seen, their work has been seen at the Centro Nacional de Cultura in Lisbon, Portugal, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, the Salford Museum in Manchester, England, and the Atlantic Center for the Arts here in Florida. And he holds 2 MFAs, one in imaging and digital arts from Baltimore, and the other in visual languages from Rio de Janeiro. And so join me in welcoming Cyriaco Lopes tonight.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here with you all, see your faces, and hope to hear you in the questions, and also on Thursday when we meet again. I'm very grateful to Craig, who I just met, for inviting me, and for Sean. Sean is a phenomenal artist. I think his work is of an originality, a complexity. It's really has been one of the great gifts of the time I lived in Florida, was to know the work that Sean does. That is really an important kind of work. And it is kind of a hub of ideas too, you know, between science and art, between different artists. It's really a pleasure to know and to accompany his work. So let's see if you can see my PowerPoint. Do you see a PowerPoint now?
Yes.
And it says Saints Martyrs, right? Very good. So good. We're in good track. So the thing is that I'd like to do today, the difficulty is to dissect a body, you have to kill it. And I'm trying not to kill it. I'm trying not to kill the work on talking about the work. So what I'm suggesting to do today, I'm gonna show you images, but I'm not gonna talk over them. I'm just gonna show the images, and I would invite you to look at them and to dream a little bit on them. And then I'm gonna talk, and I'm gonna talk about some foundational ideas for the work, but indirectly about the work. And I'm gonna repeat this. So I'm gonna show 3 minutes of images, then I'm gonna talk a bit, then 3 minutes of images, then I'm gonna talk a bit. That's the way that I organized for tonight. Okay, if everyone is good with this plan. So let's take a look at these images for the next 3 minutes. One more thing, one thing I would like to ask you, and of course you're free to, you know, do as you want, but if you can, at some point, if you want, I would love if you told me the 2 images from Saints Martyrs that you like most. I like to ask this. To me, it's always interesting to know what are people most interested. Okay, so we can, at the end, when we talk, I would be super glad to hear. Okay, so let's see some images of this project, Saints Martyrs. So those are photographs. And I like that there is an ambiguity to the work that it could be sculpture. No? I think it's one of those rare works that you have to correct. No, it's not sculpture, it's photography. It's not as common. And normally they start as a sculpture. Then I paint a sculpture. Then I create an environment for the sculpture. And in the sculpture, I use polymer clay, beeswax, molding wax, soap, all kinds of things. And also for the environment, I use all kinds of different materials. Then I do the lighting, which actually is one of the things that takes the longest. Then I take the photograph and I still have a layer that is digital. And I'm very interested in the genre fluidness of the work. Now, the work is in between this media and is all of those media at the same time, even though when you look at it, it's a photograph, it's an image. And that to me is very important. In fact, once I take the shot I'm interested in, all the sculptures are recycled and the paintings and everything that went in. So instead of photography being this document of something that existed, things existed in photography. I like to think of photography as this arena where the work is happening. In fact, most of the time when I'm working on them, the camera, the photo camera is broadcasting it to my computer. So I'm doing something on them and looking at them in the screen of the computer. So I'm always looking at them as images, not as three-dimensional objects. So they exist inside photography at all times. The different studios that I worked for this. Now, of course, in the United States, during modernism, there was this very influential idea by this critic of the specificity of the medium. We have to remember that was a regional thing, was here in the US, was not that widespread actually. But in the US, this was very influential. And this guy said, Clement Greenberg, that every art medium should only do the job that they are meant to do. So they could be pure. And of course, this is very associated with the idea, his idea, that painting should be abstract because narrative is the helm of literature. So let writers tell stories and painters should just use color and form and so on. That idea was a little bit dumb at the time. And since then, it has just become more dumb. And I think there are very few artists that believe in it. Even Greenberg, if you read him carefully, even himself retract a bit from it. But that is a background that we have to understand for artists working in the past 50 years, particularly in the US. And some of the artists that broke those rules and that are working this intersection between photography and sculpture are some people that I like very much. I think Thomas de Man is one of the first names that would come to the mind of most people when they think about this subject. He's fantastic. As you know, he does these sculptures in paper, right? He photographs made of paper. Like everything in the photograph is made of paper. James Cassaberry, who does these architectural models, which are super beautiful. And Erin Shearer, and I'm just showing three, who does these modernist sculptures, maquettes, which she photographs. Her work there are other complexities to her work. Now, I love those artists. One thing that's interesting to me is that in the realm of photography, their photography has a modernist quality. If I don't tell you those stories, they look like modernist photography. So they are kind of, they disguised. They are the sheep in wolf's clothes. And the wolf is modernism, right? And it's, to me, relevant that James Casaberry's work is all about modernist architecture, and her work is all about modernist sculpture. She's very interested in Tony Smith. In the end, a lot of their work is about the job that photography does between representing reality or illusion. No, it fools you. It fools you for a second, but it does fool you. That's not reality. That question is less interesting for me. And as you saw in my images, it doesn't have a lot to do with what I'm interested in. I must say, because I always like politics, photography was never a purveyor of truth to me. Photography has been manipulated from start in the darkroom. And of course, I began using Photoshop the moment that they released it in the market. It was in 1982, and I learned it when they first released it. So when I was still in undergrad. So it's not, this idea of photography telling the truth is not the thing that I'm looking for in my own work. Now, what I'm looking for is in things like this, is the invisibility of photography. The thing is, if I ask you, what is this? You probably say, oh, those are no Sumerian sculptures. Those are the sculptures from ancient Mesopotamia. But they're not, right? Those are two photographs. I think it would be very few people would answer you, what is this? And I said, those are two photographs. See, every art history book is a book of photographs. All art history books are filled with photographs. And those photographs are invisible because we don't see them. And that is a thing I am interested in. That is what actually has a lot to do with my work. You look at those sculptures, you're not looking at sculptures, right? You're looking at photographs of sculptures. Photographs of sculptures are different of sculptures. There are lots of statical decisions here. What is the angle, which is very important for a sculpture, like a photography in profile, by front and 3/4. What is the lighting of the sculpture? What's the framing of the sculpture? All of those elements are static decisions, and yet they are invisible. In fact, photography looks a lot as painting used to look before the Impressionism. Is this window where you look directly through it, and it's a transparent window. I'm not as interested in that transparency. I actually like its opacity as a photography. So I like to make clear that it's a photograph. There is also something that interests me in these kinds of images, which is this loss that the photography is mediating your experience. Now, as I normally say, it's like a porn to sex. No, it's not sex, it's porn. It's you are imagining how it will be when you finally meet that sculpture in real life, which in this particular case will be with 50 tourists around it in Berlin, the Nefertiti. And it's one of the few places I know, one of the few rooms that I know in Europe that you cannot take pictures. So just because it's so crowded. But the experience of meeting the work in person is so different of the experience of looking at that image. And that is part of what I'm looking at. I think there is a loss. When you look at my work, there is a loss because you can't directly engage the sculpture. It's mediated by the photograph. And I think that loss is part of its melancholy. It's a subtle thing, but I think it's an important element. And another thing that is maybe one of the most important things for me is that photography is the medium of death, right? Because everyone that is in a photograph is dead. If you take a picture of yourself, by the moment, so you took a selfie, and then when you look at the selfie in your phone, the person in the selfie does not exist anymore because that person is now the person who is looking at the selfie. Even if it is 1 second after, that person is past. Photography is the medium of the past and is the medium of death. Sculpture, on the other hand, is the medium of the present. Because sculpture is a body in the world. It's the only artwork that is this body in the world, like our bodies in the world. And I think what happens when the past of photography meets the present of sculpture is that loss. You lost that presentness of sculpture, and that friction generates that melancholy. But the other thing is, which I also think generated a certain melancholy, is that it creates a different time, which I think is a suspended present. The sculpture is in the present, but that present is inaccessible because of photography. And so that, to me, is also part of the melancholy of the project. So let's those ideas dance a bit in your mind. Let's look at some more images. And hopefully this will happen. So while you look at the images, the ideas are dancing in your mind. And when we discuss these things, the images are dancing in your mind. Okay, so 3 more minutes of images. Now, let me talk a little bit about this guy, Aleijadinho. Because, you know, all of us artists, you and me and all artists, we really have only one medium. It's only one thing we have to work with, which is our lives. And I don't mean this necessarily in a confessional way. I mean that it's our experiences and our discoveries are the things that become the matter of the work that we do. And so I just want to show this experience that is very influential in my work, which was when I was to turn 17. So I was 16, I was going to turn 17. I asked my father to take me to this place, to see this place. It's a great work of art by a great artist called Aleijadinho. He was arguably the greatest 18th century American artist. It's certainly one of the greatest American artists. There are some, Mexico has some amazing painters, you know, Villapando, for instance. And he was an architect and a sculptor. And he helped to design this. Of course, at the time, this is the Baroque. There are many people doing things in a project. And he did mostly these little chapels and the stairwell to the church and the sculptures of the project. For you to have an idea, this is the plan of the project. You see that psychological, you're supposed to start from the bottom and go up. And this is in the top of a very tall mountain. This is a state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, which is a state of very tall mountains. It's famous for having very tall mountains. And you go in the zigzag between the chapels, and then you go to the stairwell, which is also a zigzag. And then you go inside the church, and the climax is the altarpiece in the church. So your body is being orchestrated, because it's this ascension to that sublime experience. That is all part of the design that Aleijadinho did. Now, when you so this is you going up. So just so you have a feeling of how it is, the physical experience. And then you arrive in front of the church and you go through this stairwell, which has the prophets, which he sculpted. Now, what I'm interested in showing to you in the context of Saints Martyrs are the little chapels. See, you can't go inside the chapel. It's super interesting because you go there. So there is this frustration that you can't go inside. And I'm thinking of it a little bit like the frustration of photography that brings the world to you, but does not allow you into the world at the same time. No, photography brings everything in front of you, but you can't go in things. But even though you can't go inside the chapel, you can look through the windows and you can look through the doors that have these holes. And what you see when you look at them are those life-size sculptures of the moments of the Passion of Christ. So it's he's going to die. So these moments, these different moments that will lead to his death in the last of the chapels. And to me, I remember seeing this and think, wow, this is extraordinary as an expressionist work. One thing that happens to me, and that still happens to me, is that because we can't go in that space, sculpture becomes image. Because you're looking at the sculpture through a viewfinder, which is the window now. And the viewfinder frames your experience and also makes the three-dimensional into an image in front of your eyes. Your eyes go through the details of the sculpture as if they were an image. And each one, of course, has a different scene. Is the originality of his work, the way that he combines a kind of folk tradition, folk art tradition, with the high Baroque of Europe is quite special. I think it's really one of the high moments of Baroque in the world, compared with any place in the world. And this is at the end of his life. This is his last great commission. So there is this thing when an artist has a kind of life experience to portray the pathos of those scenes, to empathize with all these different subjects. Not only with Christ, there is a different Christ in each chapel. In fact, there is a chapel that has two Christs because it's two moments. But also the people around him, the saints, the peasants, the people around him. And when he was younger, he was more realistic and he evolved to be more expressionist. It's a work I have been carrying with me for all my life, since I turned 17. I think I turned 17 there, or maybe the day after, because we went to another place. He was from a city called Ouro Preto. This is in a city called Congonhas, but he lived in another city that's not too far from that one called Ouro Preto, which was the richest American city at the time in the 1700s. And this is quite remarkable that someone who was born an enslaved person, and he was freed as a child, but still he didn't have a lot going for him. He was born enslaved, became the most prestigious, the most important artist in the richest American city, and one of the great artists of the continent in the 18th century. Now, because this is a sculpture, I thought it would be cool to look at a little bit of a documentary, so you have more of a feeling of it. And so I'm going to show you 3 minutes of those sculptures in situ. So, can you see YouTube now?
Jornal como de costume.
Are you, yeah, and can you hear? Did you hear the guy? Okay, very good. So 3 minutes of that.
Dedica-se, por fim, ao Santuário de Nossa Senhora do Bom Jesus de Matosinhos, em Congonhas do Campo, para empreender, já sexagenário, a enorme tarefa de encenar, em tamanho natural, os passos da Paixão de Cristo. Como se não bastasse, como remate de uma vida inteiramente dedicada à arte, ainda compõe arquitetonicamente o adro do santuário. E no ermo da colina, enfrenta novamente os toscos blocos de pedra azulada, de onde vai extraindo, sem lhes roubar a consistência, as figuras bíblicas, gravando-lhes no gesto, nas cartelas e na face, as sentenças proféticas.
Notice that in the photograph I showed you and in this film, which is from the 70s, the Last Supper is all white behind. And that's because they painted all white, but originally everything was colored, like in this one. Nowadays it's all restored. They took from the photograph, from old photographs, and they restored the colors. So there is this environment. So this idea that three-dimensional things become an image, I trace directly from the experience of looking through the viewfinder in there. Another work that I love, that's exactly the same thing, and that you probably will all know, is this one, De Tandonnet by Marcel Duchamp. Isn't it exactly the same thing? No, it's you go to the Philadelphia Art Museum, you find this door. By the way, there is kind of dark. In this picture is bright, but when you go there, it's kind of dark. And you can't go inside, and you look in the cracks of the door. And then, spoiler alert, you see this picture of a naked woman. And this is a sculpture. Her body is a sculpture. Everything is very, not everything, but most of the things here are very three-dimensional. This is my favorite work by Duchamp. I love this work. I always love this work. And it's the last work he did too. So there is an interesting parallel with Aleijadinho. In fact, as you know, Duchamp retired from art and he spent 20 years playing chess. But in that retirement, he was doing this work. He didn't tell anyone he was doing this work, but he was doing this work. And it's curious because in his youth, he talked about artists become too retinal. No, it's too much based on the eye. But he has lots of works in the relationship between sculpture and photography. He's actually one of the key people for doing this. Photography is not only documenting his work, but it's making the work in his collaborations with Man Ray. So for instance, when he accumulates dust in his studio, that becomes a work when Man Ray photographs it, right? What else is dust in the studio? And this is a work that happens in your eye. His anemic cinema too, that is something that only exists, is an illusion, is a circle that is spinning. The image only exists inside your eye. It doesn't exist objectively. And that is the same, is a similar thing. He makes us in a peeping Tom looking at this. It's kind of uncomfortable to do it. It's actually a very uncomfortable work in many different ways. And these, by the way, you don't see this there, but this is how it looks. If you could see, that's what you would see. This is the behind the scenes. So you can see that's a very three-dimensional construction that creates this image that you see from the cracks of the door. Now, allow me for a few minutes of speculation, like wild speculation. But it's kind of well-grounded, but it's also a bit wild speculation, which is there a connection between the work of this Black artist in the 18th century working in the mountains in the interior of Brazil, and this white Frenchman working in New York, both of them in the 20th century, both of them at the end of their careers and lives. They both died not long after the completion of the works. Well, I think there is. But that is the speculation part. See, because I know who this woman is. We all know, because this is in Duchamp's diaries, journals. This woman is the great sculptor, Maria Martins, who was his lover. She was his lover for about a decade. He was the love of his life. He always wanted to marry her, and she never wanted to marry him because she was happily married. She was also happily his lover. She was happily married with a guy, and she was happily his lover for 10 years. And then when her husband returned to Brazil, she returned with him, and they didn't see each other again. And he says that piece was her, was for her, was about her. So there is this. She is a little bit La Marie Misogyny, that in the large glass there is this woman that is inaccessible for the bachelors. She is that woman. She's a little bit that woman. She's inaccessible for him. And let me just say, she was a phenomenal. This is maybe a bit irrelevant, but allow me to say this. She was a phenomenal sculptor herself. And in fact, in the 40s, she was a much more famous artist than he was. She showed with the Surrealist big exhibitions and got great success. In fact, the first time she did a solo show here in New York was a two solo shows side by side, was she and a guy. And her solo show sold out. The introduction was by Breton. And the funny thing is, the guy who was having the other solo show beside her, who was her friend, didn't sell anything. So she bought a painting by his show and donated it to MoMA, which was a new museum at the time. And MoMA did not want it. MoMA said, no, we do not want that painting. And she used her prestige to force MoMA to accept the painting. And that is how MoMA bought its first Tate Modern painting. So to me, it's just a great story of how reputations in the art world change through time. Nowadays, Modern is so identified with MoMA, and for a long time, you would not see Maria Martins at MoMA. Now you do. And that is, there is a reason why she became less known, and no, there are a number of reasons. I think the first one is that she was a woman, and then that she was Latin, and then that she was from the Southern Hemisphere, and that she chose to live in São Paulo instead of the Northern Hemisphere. Now, that woman was born and raised in the city of Campanha, which is the city you see at the bottom in the left, which is in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. A very cultivated family, very erudite, a lover of art. Now look how close it is for the place where the Aleijadinho is. It's only 4 hours drive today. To me, it's completely unbelievable that Maria Martins would not have gone to see the Aleijadinho many times growing up, because Aleijadinho is the most famous artist in the state for ancient art. And the modernists love, the Brazilian modernists, which are very different of US modernists, loved the Baroque. In fact, they are the ones that made the Baroque very well known in Brazil. So to me, it's not a great stretch to imagine in this time in which they were lovers for a decade, she mentioning to him that experience of Aleijadinho. Oh, you go there and there's a door, you can't go inside, and you look through a hole in the door and there is this thing happening inside. I mean, if I'm sleeping with someone for 1 year, I would have mentioned this work. This is a work I like very much. I just met you and I'm mentioning this work. And so maybe this is a creative misunderstanding. No, it's the way that he dreamed the thing that she once described in a moment of intimacy to him. And I can't prove this, but I don't think it's such a far-fetched idea that these two works of art would be connected. They certainly both connected to my own work, in this idea that sculpture becomes image. In this separation, as having this idea of the loss, the melancholy of loss, the expressionist quality of it. These are definitely things that I pursue. So how about, let's look a little bit more Saints Martyrs. No. So for this module, I want to talk a little bit about the space, the physical space in which the work exists. I'm very interested in the space of pre-Renaissance. So as you know, in European painting, in the Middle Ages, everything was very flat. And then during the Renaissance, there is this illusionistic idea of depth. But there is a moment in between. That moment in between, that's the one that I like. I mean, I love the things before and after, but this is what interests me in my own work. And I have here an example of Giotto, but could be Frangelico, Masaccio, a number of people. And what interests me here is there is a three-dimensional space in this painting. Those bodies are inside a space. But that space is not illusionistic, it's not naturalistic. No, like, how is this woman going to walk in that house? No, there is no space for her to walk. It's all, the furniture is, she would have to climb in the bed to walk in that house. In that space, which is a shallow space, there is a space, but it's shallow, pushes everyone, all the characters, to the front and create a theatrical space. It's very similar to a stage. That emphasizes the dramaticity of the story, of the narrative. So it's much more dramatic, I think, than the high Renaissance illusionistic space that recedes infinitely. But that also presupposes a person standing and still looking at it. So it's in here, the perspective kind of changes around depending on where you're looking at. And I try to do it. And I will say in my bragging, it's much harder to do in the thing that I do because I'm actually doing something three-dimensional. So I'm creating false perspectives. And it's subtle, but they are there. They are false perspectives in a three-dimensional environment. And I sometimes spend a lot of time to do this that most people will not notice, but it's something I'm interested in. And of course, I think Max Beckmann is the great artist to do that. Max Beckmann, the great German expressionist. And all his work is based on the shallow space of the pre-Renaissance. And because of that, all the characters are, it looks like the background is pressing them against the glass which is the pictorial front. And that creates a dramatic quality that is proper to expressionism. So he doesn't ever need to depict something dramatic. His space is dramatic. Having the European Baroque had a kind of a shallow space more than Renaissance, which comes before, as you know. So this device of having a curtain behind the main subject also is obviously very theatrical and also brings the character close to the viewer, creates this dramatic space. That guy in particular is one of my favorite artists called Guercino. And the last time they allowed us to travel, which just before COVID, I went to see this painting for my birthday. So you see, I like to spend my birthdays with great artworks. And so this is the physical space in which the work exists. And there is, now the psychological space where the work exists, to me, is very connected to the idea that in this particular book. See, Michael Fried is a modernist critic. And then later on, he wrote about Jeff Wall, the photographer, the wonderful photographer. And Jeff Wall took him to Caravaggio, which is very interesting. Also, he wrote about Jeff Wall. He mentioned Caravaggio when he's writing about Jeff Wall. Then he writes a book about Caravaggio. And then he writes a book about the Caravaggists, which are the painters who followed Caravaggio, which one of them being Guercino. And in this book, he has a concept that I love, in which he says, at that period, painting becomes, the characters in a painting are divided between absorption or address. So the guy on the lower left is pouring wine. He's absorbed by the action, by what he's doing. He's in his own world. And the guy playing the instrument in the right, he's in address. He's looking at you, the viewer. Obviously, this painting is a phenomenal example of address. I think it's one of the best examples in the world of address, in which Venus is looking directly at the viewer, and the Cupid is about to pierce your heart. He's looking directly at you. Both things create a psychological space, which I use in my work. I will give this example, even though this example is also pre-Renaissance. So it's not an example that Michael Fried would have used in his book, but I really love this painting. And it's an annunciation. But in this annunciation, you only see the woman, the Virgin. And she just noticed that the angel is in the room. I'm not even sure if she can see him yet. That creates a magnetic space. I'm looking at her. She's absorbed, looking at someone outside the frame. There is a triangle here. That triangle is full of desire. Of course, in Christian mythology, this is the moment of intercourse, spiritual intercourse, but that's a moment in which you become pregnant. So there is this triangle, is this absence that is very present in the eyes of the character, is something that is in all the works that I have been doing. It's this erotically charged other. These guys in my work, they are giving themselves, they are giving their bodies to someone that can't be seen in the image, but that can be felt. And that erotic charge between my eye, the character's eye, in this third figure, which is outside the frame, creates this psychological triangle, which I think is very, very important for the work, for the charge of the work. Now I'm gonna show you one last batch of images, and then I'm gonna get one last thing to finish after this batch of images, one last module to finish. You know, just to finish this last few minutes, just to talk about another source for this work. And just as an example, could be many examples, but I'll give you one example, which was going to this palace in Venice, and the thing flying is an ancient sculpture, it's a Roman sculpture. And this Renaissance collector built this whole room just to house that sculpture. It's magnificent. It's a small room, but it's magnificent. And the ancient sculpture represents Ganymedes, who was a shepherd, who Zeus, the chief god of the Greeks, kidnapped and raped and become his lover. So Zeus was married with a woman, Juno, but he also had this boyfriend. They all lived in the same house, it worked for them. And so this guy builds this whole room to have this sculpture. In the 1500s, I went looking for something to read about it. I found a paper by an art historian, a paper in Italian by an Italian art historian. And the guy is talking about how Ganymedes, for the collector, represents the soul, and the eagle represents the God. And that so God is taking, if you do the right things, God will take your soul up. Except that at the entrance of, when you go through the door, there are two sculptures each side of the door. And the one in the right is Emperor Hadrian. And the one to the left is his boyfriend, Antinous. Another guy, Hadrian was married, even though he was never home. He traveled all his life. But he loved this guy, he loved Antinous. And so much so that he made him into a god. And hundreds of years after Antinous died, he was still worshipped as a god. That's one reason we have so many sculptures of him, because there are many temples for him. But originally, he was the boyfriend of Hadrian. So, no, this is not the soul and God and all this. No, this makes no sense. This is what I'm calling gaslighting. This is a temple for gay love. Like the guy has Antinous and Hadrian, and then you go inside it and it's Ganymedes and Zeus. Please, that's definitely a temple for gay love. And the art historians make such an effort to erase us from history, to erase women, to erase queer people, to erase people of color. And it's not a subtle, I mean, you have to go to great lengths to do it. It's not an easy task to make those erasures because we were always there. No, and I was taking those pictures. So for instance, this cup used to be in storage at the British Museum for a long time. And it's very recent that is exhibited again. So I took this, I don't have the date, but I took this picture less than 10 years ago when it first came about. They didn't even have pictures of this cup. And this is what one thing I was doing. This I thought Sotheby's. You know that in Germany, during the Renaissance, this is more mannerism. But if you want to insult someone and call the person gay, you know, a slur, a gay slur in Germany in the 1600s was to call some person a Fiorentino, like someone from Florence. And now you look at this painting and say, I understand why they would be saying that. And looks very fun. Florence looks very fun. And if you look at the artists at the time, you look at Donatello, who was as you know, the teacher of Michelangelo. And you look at Michelangelo. Michelangelo is documented as having boyfriends, as desiring men, being in love with a cavaliere, the guy, the nobleman that he was in love. In fact, Florence asked him to paint a battle scene to show how brave the Florentine are. And that was his sketch. His idea was, it's not really the battle yet. They are all naked, swimming in the river. And then someone says, oh, look, we're being invaded. And so, please, there is no Charlton Heston playing Michelangelo that will change who Michelangelo was. No, this is Leonardo's boyfriend. Leonardo went to jail for being gay, for having sex with men. And so went Benvenuto Cellini. I also went to jail for having sex with men. So all those things were readily available. No one discovered those letters of Michelangelo this guy has an autobiography in which he narrates a great episode when he takes a beautiful guy dressed as a woman to a party of artists with prostitutes, female sex workers. And no one can tell that. And they elected his boyfriend as the most beautiful woman in the party without knowing that he was a guy. So my remedy to this gaslighting was to go to museums and photograph what I call the unacknowledged museum of gay art. So this is in Rome, this is in Russia, in St. Petersburg. And it's not an artwork. I was not doing an artwork. I was just doing because I want to have that museum. I want that museum in my head. And no, that Bacchus we just saw is 2,000 years old. This is 100 years old. So it never stopped. It always had, this was always happening. Lots of Ganymedes, lots of Ganymedes. I can go a bit faster because we're almost finishing here. In the hermaphrodite, this is an ancient Rome fresco of an hermaphrodite, also an obsession. This is in Turkey of the ancients. You can imagine what is missing here. No, this is in Pergamon in Turkey. So creating this museum for myself is a museum with an audience of one, because it's just for myself. Was very important to me because also it got me looking at sculpture in all these places, this sculpture that is charged erotically. This is, of course, one of the greatest, the Hermaphrodite. Every great museum in the world has a copy of that sculpture, the Hermaphrodite. And it's great as a sculpture because you look from a side and it looks like one thing. Then you look to the other side and it's something else. No, the Hermaphrodite has both sexes. The first time I went to the Uffizi in Florence, it was shown against the wall. So you couldn't see that they were both sexes at the same time. Nowadays they changed and you can see that they are both things. And in this process, This is at the Louvre, which is the most famous one. And finally, this is the last image. This is the last thing I'm gonna say, because this is the image I saw the day before I started this project, Saints Martyrs. And I was at the National Gallery in DC, and I looked at this and I thought, wow, this guy wants to represent a beautiful man. This passage of St. John is not represented anywhere else. This is a very tiny moment of his life. He went to the desert, he took out his expensive clothes and put rags. But of course, the painting is not really about this, right? It's about this beautiful man. And the thing is, I don't know anything about Domenico Veneziano's sex life, romantic life. It's not necessarily about this dichotomy about being gay or being straight. It's about this erotic gaze. Plato in Greece had this equation between the good, the truthful, and the beautiful. All three things need to be the same. And this is standard until Renaissance. Until today, you still see people doing this. So an artist like Domenico Veneziano would never represent a saint as an ugly person. It needs to be beautiful, because being beautiful means that you are right and that you are good and that you are true. So this is a testimony of a man, of how another man should be if he is beautiful. And that is not connected to sexual orientation. But that erotic drive, I think, permeates art. This idea of trying to understand what beauty is a sister of the erotic drive. And I think it's one of the places where art comes from. Certainly one of the places that Saints Martyrs comes from. And the day after, this was in DC, the day after I came back to New York City, and I did the first one of the series. So thank you for listening, and I would love to hear from you, your ideas.
Thank you so much, Cyriaco. That was amazing. That was really great. Really appreciate it. Do people have questions?
Well, I have a question. So I was wondering what it meant to you when you put yourself in those photographs, because there's a couple with your face in it, and I was wondering like what that meant to you. How is that different than the rest of the piece?
Chandra, can I do the most annoying thing ever that when everyone hates when someone does this, but please allow me to do it, which is to ask you, do you think those images are different of the other ones? It's just because to me, it's very helpful to hear what people think, since I'm so immersed in this work. Basically, I do this anytime I'm not sleeping. So I'm doing this. So do you feel the work is charged in a different way, Chandler?
Well, I would think that whatever emotion or concept that is in that specific piece, I feel that those specifically it would be more personal, I guess. I would attach that to you in some way.
Fantastic. See, they are rarely confessional. They rarely are describing a particular moment in my life, even though we're going to discuss Leo Nilsson next week, who did this in every single work he did, and his work is beautiful for this. And in fact, one of them, I was reading the Argonauts. In most of them are really referring to Greek mythology or Roman. It's not very often to Christian mythology, but it's still called Saints Martyrs. And I was reading the Argonauts, and so that's why there is the Greek ship coming in, and there is this god putting rain, which sunk the ship. Of course, you don't need to know this because it's not an illustration of the Argonauts. Most people will not know this. But to me, when I used myself in the work, to me, it was a more performative, it gave a performative quality to the work, and it broke a bit the dollhouse effect. I want to do something grittier. And the way that I found to do it was to add this element of performance to the work and to break it a bit. But of course, every work anyone does is personal. So I'm sure my ex-boyfriend would be very good at telling like exactly what's going on each time, each photograph. But normally it's unintentional. I very rarely I'm intentionally describing something that went in my life. I felt that I was hired as an actor in those pieces. Does it make sense, Chandra? Thank you. Thank you for the question.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll limit it to one. I was very invested. So I have a question. So you're creating this triangle, as you say, where you are capturing the object of desire yourself, but you're also having the object of desire look to an unknown space, which I think is very interesting. Is this kind of like your way of commenting or like restricting information from the viewer to kind of play in their expectations of what they deserve to see, or is it more kind of like a commentary of like kind of like the gaze and like limiting what the gaze is supposed to see? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this is super interesting, Lindsay. No, I love the way that you framed it. The thing with desire is that desire only exists in the absence of fulfillment. Once you fulfill your desire, desire dies. So the work is about desire. And so the gaze, I was very interested, I must say, in the male gaze. But of course, in this very particular male gaze, which is looking at other men, we talk so much about men looking at women's bodies. But is the same thing applicable when a man is looking at another man? So, because those men, some of their models are, for instance, the odalisks, which are those racist creations of Europeans. Know that this woman, this is Muslim woman in harems that are totally available for the gaze of the man, of the straight man. And my guys are a little bit like this, but of course, because they are men, there is a different relationship with it. And also the fact that they're not quite available for the people looking, for us looking at the image, they are available to this third person. So the gaze is very important. It's one of the central elements and goes back to the absorption and address that we discussed during the talk. But going to what you put so well, Lindsay, the main idea is that desire can only exist when it cannot quite be fulfilled. That's the whole idea of advertisement. You know, like if you buy this toothpaste to be sexually happy, most commercials are like this. No, you'll be laughing for no reason. But of course, once you use the toothpaste, you do not. And that gap between what you want and what things proportionate to you is where desire lives. And that is the subject of the work, is the thing that I'm interested in doing. Does it work, Lindsay? Does it make sense?
Oh, 100%. Sorry, I similarly think about photography in that way too. So it was pretty exciting to think about this. So thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more. So like I can see like your like the gaze and like how that plays into your work. And I don't know, maybe I've just been looking at a lot of Matisse lately, but I do see like a Matisse influence like with the decorative patterns and the way you use space. Can you talk a little bit more about like the patterning and like designs that you use when creating your works?
I am guilty. That is so true. I love Matisse. I mean, who doesn't love Matisse? Is any of you do not love? I mean, I don't like you. If you don't love Matisse, I don't like you. It's Matisse is that he is that artist that your aunt loves. No, your aunt that doesn't like modern art, she likes Matisse and Monet. Those are the two that she likes. And so yes, I'm very interested in Matisse because Matisse is also the loser, right? There was a moment in which there was a competition when art was one movement after another movement, when the history of art was a linear narrative during modernism. There was a bifurcation, and you have to make a choice because art could only go one way, and you can't have two things at the same time. And it was, will it be Picasso, which is structure, or will it be Matisse, which is sensation? And it was Picasso. It was definitely Picasso. You go from Picasso directly to conceptual art in the 1960s. There is no break in that linear line of modernism. Matisse is the guy that everyone loves, but also everyone thinks, oh, he was the bourgeois, no, he was the failed. It's the cul-de-sac of modernism. So that underdogness already interests me, and that connects with lots of people that have been erased. You know, part of what people didn't like about his work is that there was a feminine, what was considered feminine at the time, which was the pattern, the decorative. Decorative was the worst insult you could throw at a person, at an artist. Even in my education, when I was educated, I'm sure my professors would want to fire squad me if they would, my professor at the time, my undergrad, would, if they saw these kinds of things. Even though, you know, one of my professors was Beatriz Milhazes. Let me put her here. I don't know if you like painting, but if you like painting, she is, no. Everyone. She's one of the best followers of Matisse working today in the world. She's one of the greatest working in this sense. And I remember when she first came about in the 1980s, people hated her work because it was decorative. So there is this. I'm interested because there are all these histories that are buried in this cul-de-sac. I don't think it's a cul-de-sac. I actually think it's a very productive. I think the decorative and the pattern creates a space that is not a space of depth. It's a space that's much flatter. That space was common in many other cultures. So in the Islamic art, which of course, for most of the time didn't use representations of people, and they had this more flat space, which I think is very productive, and that Matisse also thought was very productive. Because remember that he going to Morocco was an important moment in his art. So African art was important for Matisse, and we always think of our Picasso, we always think about the masks in Picasso. But we should remember the patterns and the decorative were also very important to Matisse, and he learned a lot from African, and particularly in Morocco, where he went and had this, you know, very important encounters. So yes, and of course, it is also a critique of Matisse, in the sense there is a racialized representation of Africans in his painting, and particularly of women in these paintings of Africa. I love those paintings, but I don't, those particular paintings, but I don't love them unreservedly. I am very aware of the context that they belong. So to me, exactly because they are problematic, they are some of the ones that I'm most interested. So, so my guys are a little bit those odalisques, so you did the perfect connection. Because my guys are those odalisques too, and I wonder, of course, I do the work to discover if my gaze, in the gaze of a man into another man's body, changes what is problematic in Matisse's painting, particularly the Moroccan, which are phenomenal works by Matisse.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Marta.
I could get. I have a question. You said photography is the medium of death, and sculpture is the medium of the present. I was wondering what your thoughts on analog collaging. Is that more of a graveyard of the dead, or is that some sort of Frankenstein that's come back to life of some kind?
This is such an interesting, complex question, right? I would have to think of what kind. I would have to be specific about the collage. But that is a very productive, because of course when we think of the start of collage, Picasso, Braque, these people they were very abstract. So to me, they are less about death. And of course, the death thing I stole from Barthes, right? The sculpture thing in the present, I don't know if I stole from anyone. I think I just said it, but the death, photography's death is kind of a paraphrasing of Barthes. And because the Picasso, Braque are so abstract, in fact, they use so much text, they use the newspapers, for instance. I would say the same thing for Hannah Hoch in Germany, that so often she's using the newspapers or things. And when you put all the images together, they don't quite make a narrative per se. Even though Picasso said he would never do an abstract work, but those are very close to abstraction. However, and I think it's much more interesting to think this, for instance, there is a woman who I think is one of the greatest ever, Great Stern, the Argentinian artist who did collage, and her collages are very narrative. Her work is hard. She's also a surrealist, right? She's actually from the group Madi. As you know, the Madi is this early modernism group from Buenos Aires, which is phenomenal. It's like they did everything 20 years earlier than all the people we studied in school, including her. But her collage, because it's so narrative, is more complex. So now I'm going to be thinking about this question for a long time, but even though it's narrative, it's not naturalistic. So it doesn't look like it's a frozen moment. It looks like it's a construction. I often say that photography is a drawer where we put dead birds, where we keep dead birds. To me, this is the definition of photography, but that is a photography that is descriptive. It's like, oh, this is my lunch today. This is how my mother looks, and so on. But in a person doing collage in the way that Greta Stern does, in which there is a strong narrative, because we don't think of it as this moment that has been frozen, but as a moment that has been constructed, I don't think her work is quite about death. It's funny, because her work is a lot about death, but as a content, not formally in the way that I was talking during the talk. So I would say this is a super interesting question, and I would say that the answer will be different according to which colors. I think Lucas Blalock, the guy that does Photoshop photograph now, who is fantastic. His photographs are not about death because they are not very narrative, they're very formal. There is a formalist quality to them. And maybe this is the cross, is between formalism and narrative, or even formalism and descriptive. The descriptive ones are more what Barthes talks about death. Does it make sense, Craig? That's a super interesting thing.
I'll accept it. I'll accept it.
Oh, that's you. I can see you now. Okay, hey.
I just had a tag onto that question that Chad just asked, because you were talking about genre fluidity earlier, and then we were also talking about how within modernism, there's this idea that each media should do what it does best and that they should be separated and held apart. And you're working in such a amazingly fluid way, using all these things, these different, talking about making sculpture as if it's already in the camera, and then also using materials in such like paint in such an expressive way. And it comes together so seamlessly, and it makes so much sense in terms of like the research that you're doing. So I was wondering if you could talk about how you're using this media to create these works together. Like, are you relying on for instance, you mentioned lighting, takes sometimes the longest, like in making the work. And I was just curious, in terms of your own studio practice, how you're using these different elements, and if you're noticing you're using certain like using paint for a certain thing, or using sculptural materials for a certain aspect of the work.
Yeah, that is, yeah, the making of it. See, I didn't speak about this work for like almost 3 years. I made a point of not speaking about it. I collaborate with my friend who is a poet, and I didn't let her do anything with this work. So now this is my side of things, and I don't want words attached to it. To let the work speak to itself for me. And it's just now that I'm starting to talk about it. Of course, while I'm doing the work, I'm living, and living is all the ideas of the work are in the way that I'm living my life. But one thing that's important to me is every time I do one, I test something new. I do something unexpected. You may not see it, but for me, every single one has something I have never done or that I did not expect. So it's yeah, I used to joke that you are in front of the person who invented the sculpture, because I just arrived in my studio. My undergrad was in painting, and I remember the ceramics professor coming, just, oh, you should come to my class and do ceramics. You'll be great at it. No, I'm a painter. I don't do three-dimensional things. And I really regret, because she was an amazing ceramicist. And she's dead now. But that work needed to be sculpture. And I remember I was eating my halal food, and it comes in aluminum foil. And I was just like that guy from, how is that Spielberg film, Third Kind?
Yeah.
Right? He's playing with his potato. I was doing the same thing, and I began doing this sculpture just after I saw that painting by Domenico Veneziano at Washington. I began doing this sculpture with aluminum foil, which was the aluminum foil of the halal. And then I photographed it, and then I did another one. And then I was at that point, I was, there must be something more interesting to do sculpture than halal aluminum foil. What should it be? And I went Googling things, and I thought the Play-Doh, and then the Amazon suggested Sculpey for sculptures, which is basically Play-Doh, which I never seen, I never heard of. And once I remember that I was taking a picture with a guy who his hand was like this, but every time I would take the picture, his hand would go slowly like this. So all the pictures he had this is, because I do a very, very, very slow shutter speed noise in the tripod. So all the pictures have this. And I went Googling I need something to put inside the polymer clay that will make it say, how could I do this? Maybe if I use a wire, I could do a wire armature. And of course, I go to Amazon and they literally have wire armature for the sculpture. So I was kind of inventing sculpture. And in each of them, I do something that I have not used. I use all these different, I use all kinds of polymer clay that are available. I use all kinds of wax that are available and soap. So the hands-on is the joy. I really wake up wanting to do it, and if I don't have to work that day, I would do this the entire day. So I used to eat while the paint was drying. Like that was whatever time you use that I have to eat the paint dry is the time I would eat. And so the materials have, and this is, you could say that my previous work was very conceptual. And I'm very happy to have done this other work too. No, it's I don't feel I have to make a choice. Does it need to be Picasso? Does it need to be Matisse? I can have it all, and including with the materials. Does it make sense? Yes?
Yeah.
Cyriaco, I'm gonna.
Froze up there.
Let's see what.
I imagine he'll come back.
Yeah.
That's the most suspenseful question. Is the way.
I wanted to ask a question.
Please, Emmanuel. Yes, please. Go for it.
So I'm kind of curious about.
Enter into it as we enter.
Hey, Craig, so you froze, so we didn't hear. Emmanuel was speaking now, but we didn't hear whatever you said before because you froze.
Okay. Am I frozen now? Am I frozen now?
Now you're good.
Oh.
Now
okay. I was. So what I said is I'm going to reserve my question about the apocalypse and John Martin and the Jake and Dinos Chapman until Thursday. But many of your earlier photographs make me think around much of those themes. But I did want to before we run out of time for you to have a chance to discuss. I know that you and Sean worked on the selection of a series of readings to share with the group for our discussion on Thursday. And I wondered if you wanted to offer a bit of a prompt or a lead in from what you've done this evening, both in methodology and content to where you'd like people to go with some of the reasons for the selections of what you guys have put together for Thursday.
Perfect. Can I do something since this is the ending and Emmanuel had just begun to speak? Can I ask Emmanuel what was the question you're going to ask so that I can wrap both things and we can finish on this if that's okay. So Emmanuel, yeah, go Emmanuel.
So I was curious to find out some of the process because like you use light and from the history of sculpture, I kind of got curious about how Caravaggio used to, play with light and create sculpture and get that kind of lighting before he paints. And you're trying to use the same process, but in the end, we don't see the reflection of that light. We see colors, and I'm trying to see how like color, kind of plays role in the sculpture, even though you use that same process, but at the end, some of the expectations are lost. And that's what I want to find out.
That is super interesting. So I'll very briefly talk about this, and then I do the readings and we're finished, but we'll be quick. So that actually, I must say, Emmanuel, that has been a question in my mind very often. Some of them actually have a very high contrast lighting that comes directly from Caravaggio, comes historically, even though I look at Guercino, who also has, there are other people that did this, but they all come from Caravaggio. The thing is, logic of the works is very pictorial, and there is a tradition of high contrast lighting in photography. I didn't want my work to be in that tradition, which is a modernist tradition. It's a choice. I made this choice. So even though I have some of those, I put my work in a place that is much more difficult, I think, because it's hard to place, to put in a tradition in photography. You can put in a tradition in painting, like Bonnard, Matisse, but not quite in photography. And I was interested in that space because it's a new space. I'm always interested in what has not been quite done yet. But from time to time, I cannot resist. And I do a very high contrast lighting because Caravaggio rules, you know, he's so good. And of course, when you go to see his work in situ, you know, when you go to the Francesi in Rome, for instance, you see a window, like an actual physical window, and the light, he painted so that the light in the painting comes from that particular window. It's phenomenal. My favorite Caravaggio is, well, one of them is hard, but is in Messina. It's one that few people go because there is no reason to go to Messina other than to go to this museum. It's a boring city, but that museum is great. And it's Lazarus coming back to life, and the light is what brings him to life. So I don't do, and I think my work is not as dramatic in the sense of Caravaggio too. I think these decorative elements that we discussed before puts it in a different tradition. But yes, I always trying to learn from him. So thank you, good point. And yes, for I'm so looking forward to see you on Thursday. The readings are, of course, directly related to the work. I did, I'm doing a class for myself. I'm teaching myself a class. So I did a list of readings for myself about the relationship between photography and sculpture. So I pick one text from a very recent book called Sculpture and Photography, very imaginatively, which I thought would give you a sense of what's being discussed in the field right now. There is an early book from the 70s that is kind of the mother of these kinds of discussions. There is the certified copy at the MoMA. There is a show in Germany. So I have a reading list for it. And also the Peter Baker text. He's working in an extraterritorialist vein that is very, there are lots of vestiges of modernism, I think. But so it's, but I thought it would be productive for us to discuss. And of course, Leo Nilsson, because Leo Nilsson was the embodiment of everything modernism was not. So all those three things combined are really, those three readings combined are really resistance to modernism. A resistance with love. I love modernism, but I resist it. So it's a resistance of love, and that is the discussion that I thought would be productive for us. I don't know what is the dynamic that Shai and Craig normally use for the discussion. I'm open to any discussion. I will just throw here that if you would, in the discussion on Thursday, if you would show a slide of your work in relation to the readings. So how do you think a reading relates to what you do or doesn't relate at all? I would love, because I would get to see a little bit of your work, but whatever the bosses say, I'm following. So,
I think that's absolute for everyone in the seminar. That's a great chance. So Cyriaco, everyone has the opportunity / responsibility to prepare short presentations per seminar based on the content that we're all exploring to discuss in that evening's seminar. So for the group, then this is an excellent opportunity, as prompted by our visiting artists, to include your work in the input that you wish to drive the catalyst of your readings and perception, and what you wish to share from what Cyriaco has given everyone to read and explore for Thursday.
Looking forward to it.
And we're right on time now with the end. So we wrapped it up well. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Cyriaco.
Thanks so much, Sham. Thanks so much, Craig. Thanks so much for all of you for being here and for the super smart, interesting questions. Looking forward to see you on Thursday.
Yes, it'll be fun.
It will.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Ciao.